Hello.
Hello.
Oh my goodness. We're back. We're back with EJ Mason and Tatiana Mac. I'm so thankful. I get to see both your faces at the same time. This is wonderful already.
So happy to be here.
Oh my gosh. Well, I think we're going to start off more or less the same way as our first panel earlier in the day. I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves, and then we'll jump into some questions that I have prepared for you, as well as any that come up in the chat as we go.
Sure.
Yeah, EJ, would you mind starting?
Sure. Hi, my name is EJ Mason. My pronouns are they, them. I believe that's on the screen in the stream, but just to remind everyone who might not be able to see, I am a senior software engineer. I work on accessibility. I read, I write, I slice, I dice. That's me.
Wonderful. Tatiana?
Hello, I'm Tatiana Mac. I use they, hun, and she pronouns. Hun is Finnish gender neutral term, which I learned when I was in Finland. And I work as a software engineer independently, and currently I'm based out of Portland, Oregon.
Wonderful. And I realize, thank you, EJ. I realized I did not say my pronouns out loud earlier today. I used she and her. But yeah, I want to start this off by saying this is a section of the workshop that we do every year as part of Global Diversity CFP Day, and it's meant to make sure that our speakers are really thinking about the impact that their talks are going to have on the audience. We want to make sure that as you're putting out these talks into the world, you are not you're not contributing harm to people, or you're minimizing that harm as much as possible, as much as you can ahead of time. And so I felt like EJ and Tatiana were some of the absolute best people to bring in to talk about this, because they're both, one, just wonderful, thoughtful people, but they also do so much in the community and in the industry to educate people, and also they really create space that is safe and inclusive in so many different communities. And I admire you both so much, and I thank you both so much for being part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's super kind, and I feel the same way about you. All.
Likewise.
So my first question is, how does your care for your audience affect the way that you prepare a new talk, or a new talk, a new slide deck, any kind of content, really?
Tatiana, if you want to go first, please.
Sure, I can go first. I think that the biggest lessons I've learned in writing talks and engaging with our audience is recognizing, and it also helps with I think, anxiety that many people, especially first time speakers or people who are giving talks in another language. That's one of my top goals. And I'm always so enamored when someone is giving a talk in a second, third, fourth language. So I think that the way that I think about this is that my only responsibility in giving a talk is to own my own point of view, which includes my own story, my own perspective, my own experiences, and on the other end of it, my own biases, my own privileges, and my own power. And once I reconcile that, I think I take that package and I look at who is my audience. I, as a speaker on stage, I'm in a moment where I have power over my audience. Everyone is sort of being forced to at least pretend to pay attention to me. And so, what am I going to do with that power? Who am I going to empower through my story? Whose names and voices am I going to try to amplify? And which power structures am I going to try to tear down and break down and explain through my own perspective? And I think once I've started to do that, it took away a lot of the fear and anxiety, because I'm only owning my own story, and that's the only thing that I can really both own and take responsibility for at the end of the day.
I mean, I genuinely don't know how I'm going to follow that as an answer. I agree with much of what you said. And I also want to acknowledge while I'm here that I've learned so much from Tatiana about caring for my audience. So I thank you for what you shared with me and with our community. I would not be able to care for my audience in the way that I do if I hadn't learned from things you share with all of us. But for me, I also think I benefit a lot from trying to understand my audience before I even make the talk itself. I have to think about my context with my audience. Like Tatiana said, I want to be aware of the power that I hold and the harm I could cause. And thinking of it like a dialogue as a discussion with my audience rather than me talking at them allows me to be able to be kinder to them and also to myself, because I don't like feeling like I'm cut off from a room and talking to someone as a talking head. I like knowing that I'm there, and that helps me to feel better when I am nervous about presenting well, particularly if it's something I care about, which I try to speak only about things that are really important to me, because I don't want to give my time for things that anyone could do better than me because they care about it more than I do. My main priority is to consider my context, like I said, and to make sure that I am trying my best to make things accessible. I try not to do too much imagery in my talks, because I don't want to spend time describing everything and taking up everyone's time. But it's important that if I do include imagery, that I describe everything. And that's mainly why you'll see I have a lot of text-based talks, because I don't want to leave people out of the fun or out of the content if I can avoid it.
Yeah,
that's really it.
I think that's a good point, specifically talking about how we present the content. So making sure that the content is on the level, but then how do you go about showing it to people? What form does it take? And if you are using GIFs or images, or or animation even in your presentation, how do you translate that into a verbal description that is hopefully succinct but still gives the same or as close to the same impact as you can for folks who aren't able to see it?
I find in doing that as well that I often find better ways to say what I want to say. If I think carefully about what I would describe for an image, I often in doing so, I find ways to help connect with the meaning, and I can even remove the image once I realize that there is a way to say what I want to say.
And for me, it's something I'm definitely not perfect at, but I find that taking an old journalistic approach that was ingrained in me, which is that only add an image if it's telling a story that the text isn't already telling. And so to EJ's point, whenever I have an image that is critical, a diagram, or providing, like in one of my talks I'm thinking about, there's an image that has a redwood tree and it has vines around it, and it's kind of important to the metaphor that I paint. So then making sure I describe that in words, and I always find it a fun challenge to really think about, when you're adding an image, how can you tie that into the narrative so that your description of the image isn't this clunky, like, oh, and here's my description for the image, but instead like, and what we're depicting here is blah, 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 blah. So it's seamless for everyone. I think that there's ways to make accessibility elegant. And I think that that's something that we're all trying to learn to do better, because we're trying to get the technical aspect of accessibility down, and using this, almost borrowing the principles from the web, right? When do we construct alt text for what? And then we can bring those principles into our talks.
I think you'll find really good examples of this if you look at how people describe GIFs on Twitter when they want to share memes and fun things with their friends. They don't often describe literally what's happening. They kind of make a joke out of it that still captures the essence of what the GIF is trying to communicate, because the point of the joke isn't often the actual GIF, it's the feeling that we associate with the GIF itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done that many times. Just it doesn't really matter, whose face this is, but like, what are they doing? What is the point? And that's definitely what I mean when I say impact. Like, what is the impact of that image? What is the impact of that GIF or whatever it is? What are you really trying to communicate? Yeah. So we've talked kind of about imagery and a little bit about the content itself. So the words that you use. What are some examples of some harmful language maybe that you see commonly used in presentations, and how would you rephrase those things?
I think EJ and I could do an 8-hour session where we just both said harmful words back and forth for 8 hours straight. I find ableist language to probably be the most egregious. I think because we have normalized it so much. I hear, and content warning, ableist language to ensue, like crazy, insane, and it's just so ingrained in our filler words, and I hear that in talks a lot, and every time I just like cringe a little bit, in particular when it's for conferences that are almost touting their inclusivity or their kindness or whatnot. And I as an able-bodied person, see that a lot. And so I know, EJ, that impacts you far more than it does me.
Thank you for acknowledging how difficult ableism can be to experience. I was going to say basically the same list of words that you could, and I won't go through them exhaustively so as to avoid causing harm to my audience. But
perhaps a
description
rather than
yes. If we're talking about how to avoid these things, it's hard until you've learned. I can freely admit that. As someone who was born disabled, I didn't understand how deeply ableist a lot of our language was and is until I had people sort of collect me on it and remind me of the history of certain words. The problem is that we're so far removed from the structural nature of ableism and the history it has on all of people across the globe that we don't think about the impact that it used to have and could still have now. The big thing about rephrasing them is to really think deeply about what you want to say, going back to describing images, because if you are thinking about the context of what you're saying, you often will find a more useful or more relevant or impactful word to replace the sort of tried ableist word that would have otherwise brought down your sentence or your point.
And I think that's true too when we think about things like idioms. Is what you're saying even going to be culturally relevant to some of your audience? Are folks going to understand? Is this a universal thing that you're saying that's going to mean anything?
I do want to give one concrete example, just to use a word we've already dropped. If you're thinking of using the word crazy, that means it has a lot of meanings to people in at least our context. I'm speaking as an American. Crazy can be used to mean something is intense or unreasonable or unfathomable, and all those words have different meanings in themselves. So try to dig deeper into the actual direction of the tone you want to use, and then replace the ableist word with the thing that has the most correct tone and the more impactful meaning for what you're trying to say.
And I think that taking that intersection of like culture, predominant culture, and also language, is that I always leave a little bit more grace for people who are communicating as not as like an English language learner for those things, and offering them helpful suggestions, because often they're taught those idioms, to your point, Aisha, when they're learning English from people that are perpetuating that sort of ableist language. I think that in addition to idioms or phrases that are very culturally specific, I think we also have to be mindful of cultural references. I know this is something that I've done in the past, is like included movie references or TV shows. And in the same spirit of alt text, it's like, what is the spirit that you're conveying? If that person hasn't seen that movie and you're hinging your talk or your explanation on a specific movie, that's going to by nature exclude a lot of people. I imagine many of us have played, I can't believe you haven't seen this movie yet. We've all had movies that we haven't seen. So if you're going to use a movie reference or a cultural reference, making sure that you can give people that in-joke moment, but then making sure that you take the time to explain why that movie is relevant, providing a succinct summary of why you use that reference. I think you can, again, do that elegantly and do that comedically while not excluding a large part of your audience that finds what you're saying to be culturally irrelevant.
I had to struggle with this when I made my most recent public talk, which is about Greek mythology. And no one has read Madeline Miller's books as often as I have, but I wanted to make sure that people got the point of why I was referencing certain figures, and so I kind of explained the context of their story. And for everyone who enjoys Greek mythology like Tatiana, it was a fun joke, but also for everyone who was just there for me trying about ableism, they still knew the characters in the cast of the story I was setting up.
Absolutely. I've seen this done effectively with a lot of different types of media, even getting into like board games. I see a lot of D&D themed talks.
Mhm.
And some do a better job than others of explaining the context and why some of these things are relevant. But it's absolutely important to keep in mind if you're gonna use a reference like that.
I have an analogy which is kind of ironic because it is kind of relying on a little bit of knowledge, but I think of it as your story should be your HTML. It should be the foundational narrative and the core story, and it should make sense without anything else. Adding a layer of presentation to help the story along is like your CSS. So it should be an enhancement, it should be something for fun. But if you remove that entire aspect of your story, it should still make sense to people.
I love that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great
But then it was
way.
ironic because I was like, wait, if you don't know HTML and CSS, I just did the thing.
It's a trap all the way down. We're doing our best, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. We're doing our best. And it's important to be able to go back to the drawing board. See, I did it again.
Now we're all going to be so aware of any metaphor, simile, or yeah, that's hilarious.
For the rest of Aisha's birthday, what metaphors am I engaging in?
Exactly. Oh my goodness. But it's important to be able to go back and refine your presentation and to take that feedback, to be able to kind of roll with that feedback if you're able to get it in the first place. And hopefully that ends up resulting in a cleaner and clearer talk.
I think that something that I just love to say out loud as someone who has some power right now is that there's absolutely nothing wrong with redoing a talk 10, 15 times. And many people who give lots of talks, way more than I do, and I've been grateful to give a lot, you can give a talk many, many times. And I am a huge proponent of revising and localizing that talk as much as possible. One of my talks that I gave the same conference as EJ's Greek mythology talk that they were referencing was systems of systems. And in that context, I recognize that I was at an accessibility conference where a lot of the audience is disabled, and recognizing I was in Canada, like what EJ said earlier about context. I gave a very different talk then than I did when I gave it in San Francisco at Clarity. And so I think I just want to allow people listening, especially newer speakers, to give the same talk multiple times and to adjust it to your audience, because that's something that I did not do the first year I spoke. I wrote 6 talks in 1 year, which is not advisable. Like, it was not a good idea. Don't be like me. Writing 6 talks in a year is a horrible idea.
It is a lot. That is a lot. Definitely.
Also, at the conference where Tatiana and I both spoke, I was able to reference Tatiana's talk because I realized that we had employed very similar themes. And so I was able to say, I said a lot of words, but please go remember to watch Tatiana's talk. And also, when I gave the talk again at a place where Tatiana had not spoken, I was able to say, go look up this talk, please, because Tatiana digs into a lot of the things that I have dug into with themes. And it's nice to sort of reference things that you think will give context, but also to recognize if someone's there. If there's been a joke that can play into your talk, you can do that too. You can play that into that's sort of the theme of the day.
And that's a really good point, EJ. That's a way to create an in-joke with a group of people that shared an experience. I give a talk.
Yes, and you know for sure that someone has the same context that you have in this context, in that situation.
Yeah, and they were at least, likely given the context to have seen the talk, even if they weren't there that day. I think about how one of my favorite talks I gave was at NEJS. So it's a Nebraska JavaScript conference. And it was in the zoo at an aquarium. So we had an aquarium backdrop. And so throughout the day, people were kind of making jokes about, giving a talk to the fishes. And it was something that everyone in the room could relate to. And so you can still kind of connect with your audience by making in-jokes without making them culturally specific, language specific. Yeah, I think that's a way to really connect with your audience.
Absolutely. And before we move on, I want to make sure that somebody says something about self-defined app. Tatiana, feel free to introduce this, explain it however it makes sense to you. But my impression of self-defined is that, and I'll drop a link as well, is that it is a dictionary that kind of allows you to check your biases when it comes to language, maybe find alternatives for words that can be harmful, and also understand some of the history of words that we've collectively identified as being harmful, and kind of understanding where you might be causing some harm.
Yeah, that was a really apt description. Self-defined is an open source dictionary that I maintain. I started it a couple years ago as like out of frustration, really, with just having people ask me to define racism over and over again. And I imagine EJ has experienced this as well. Is there's an exorbitant amount of emotional labor placed on marginalized peoples to explain our experiences, the oppressive structures that are at play for us, to explain our identity, to question our identities. So my hope in creating this open source dictionary was to provide a place where people could self-define, hence the name, and to take words about our identity, whether it be our gender, our orientation, our race or ethnicity, our ability, and to center our own perspectives of it, and to really show how complicated and nuanced they are. It kind of deviates from normal dictionaries, because I think normal dictionaries are authoritarian. They're written, especially English dictionaries are written by old white people, and they've been that way forever. So yes, the definition of racism, sub item 3 on the Merriam-Webster, is not including the idea of oppressive structures or the systemic aspects of racism. So I really wanted to create a place where those ideas could be shared and to have validity to them. Because people often do go to the dictionary as an authoritative source, and they tend to forget that the dictionary was written by people, and it perpetuates oppressive ideas, because that's how it works. So yeah, I really like the dictionary because it also shows nuance. And I think that's also something lacking, is that I don't think I or anyone else writing an entry is the authoritative source on what it means to be gender fluid or gender queer. But what we can do is to write a definition that includes as much nuance as possible, and to link out to personal narratives and essays where people have really like parsed this apart. And I think that the last thing I'd like to say is that there is it's not about creating one source of truth. It's about showing the richness and the many stories of truth that, especially when we're talking about self-identity, there's a lot in between the spectrum, right? These definitions are very spectral. So creating room for that, and giving more people a platform to do that.
Before we move on, I do want to say a thank you, because I've been able to personally link out to definitions from the Self-Defined app when talking to people and when trying to explain things. And to your point about richness and context, the definition of ableism that exists on Self-Defined, I'm very glad it's there, because I can link people to it and they get to learn about how important it is to know that ableism has context with anti-Blackness, which is something that's very relevant to a lot of experiences that aren't often discussed, even when ableism is discussed. So it was very important to me as a contributor, when we helped to write that definition, to give that context, people can be invited to learn more about why it's important to learn about these structures together. And that's one of the many ways I think that Self-Defined is having a very positive and important impact on people who visit it.
Yeah, EJ, you did a really great job on that definition. I think that it really illustrated the way in which the dictionary is intended to be collaboratively written, that you were sharing your perspective in your readings of, I believe it was Talila Lewis.
Yes, that's them.
And yeah, so being able to pull in their words and to get multiple perspectives from other disabled folks, and centering many perspectives around the very complicated definition around ableism.
Wonderful. Oh, and I only just realized that Kurt had already dropped the link, so thank you. We did have a question, and that is, Do you let your inner critic identify areas for improvement, or is it usual for audiences to give feedback where you can improve upon, on what you can improve upon?
I'll speak for myself. I always let my inner critic identify areas for improvement. It never stops. There's never a time where my inner critic does not lets me love a talk and leave it alone. I think it's helpful for me, for certain audiences, to give feedback on areas in which I can improve. Speaking as someone who experiences ableism whenever I go to speak at a public event, I don't want to open myself for feedback from every single member of every audience I don't know. But I will happily go to people like Aisha or Tatiana or other close friends of mine, or anyone who I know speaks and can give really insightful feedback, who trust me as a whole person, to give me feedback on my talk. What I won't do is say, hey, everyone, hey, room full of strangers, how do you feel about me today? How do you feel about my talk?
I think that's important. You want to think about your own safety, and you also want to think about what quality of feedback am I really going to get from this interaction. But Tatiana, please.
I think, yes, supporting everything that EJ just said. I also I receive a lot of unsolicited feedback myself. I imagine that's not just me. I've literally had someone write me like a play-by-play of every single error I made in a talk, and some of the errors were like helpful, like a misspelling or something. That's fine. But I think that goes back to what I said earlier about really only trying to focus on owning my story as much as possible. And so if you're giving me feedback about my story, I would hope that there's a bit of acknowledgement that you might be trying to correct my lived experiences. You can give me feedback on, yeah, spelling or the way that I said something and how it made you feel. But I think people need to tread lightly when giving feedback, especially when something's so deeply personal. Something that I do want to mention too is, especially for conference organizers out there, is please do not send unsolicited feedback about talks directly to speakers. I do not know how to not read things that are sent to me. So I have received unfiltered feedback, which includes, especially when you're talking about casual topics like white supremacy and colonialism, you're going to get a lot of trolls. And I have steeled myself to a lot of that sort of feedback, but please act as a layer of filtration and ask for consent whether your speaker wants the feedback or not before sending it. Because to EJ's point, you could be exposing yourself to all kinds of harm. And then I would say that, for all of us as attendees, if you're going to give feedback, make sure that the person even asked for feedback. That's a huge thing about feedback, is if someone isn't asking for feedback, your feedback is going to be far less well received. And as a speaker, be clear about whether or not you want feedback. If you don't want feedback, like, find a way to say that. If you do want feedback, find a way to set some framing around it. So like being able to say, I would love feedback on this part of my talk or this aspect. Parts of my talk that aren't really up for feedback, or when I'm talking about my lived experiences, things like that. I think that setting boundaries and requesting consent are very critical. And to answer the original question, I try to make my inner critic as much my outer critic. And the only critiques that I think I take most seriously are the ones from people I have power over on specific axes, right? So if I'm receiving feedback about the way in which I spoke about trans folks, and I receive that from a trans person, I'm going to really value that feedback and take that to heart and make sure I reduce harm on that. But if it's like a majoritized person telling me that their feelings were hurt because I talked about white supremacy, I'm probably going to tune that out.
Yeah, I think there's a big note for people who are in the audience here to consider whether you're trying to help someone or censor them when you give them feedback. And it's very hard to notice that if you are the person who's committed to being to censoring someone else. But if you're trying to avoid being harmful, ask yourself if what you're saying is in support of the person you're giving feedback to, or if it's in support of you and your comfort.
That's a really good nuance. And I would say that in addition to that, I think so often feedback is relayed as statements. And I don't think often enough we have enough context in order to truly give good feedback. So your feedback might genuinely be better framed as a question. Now, I'm going to also make the caveat that don't do the more of a statement, not a question type thing, because that's just annoying. But maybe you should be asking a question about something because you might be missing some critical context. Asking questions is a really easy way to not make an ass of yourself, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm wondering what speakers can do on the day of to make their sessions more accessible and more inclusive.
For me, this really depends on where I'm speaking and what the situation and setup for that area is like. If I'm in a new space for a new conference I've never spoken at before, I will make sure that if I haven't been able to test it, that my stuff looks okay, and that it sounds okay. I will also advocate for better framing of certain things if I know some people might not be able to see from a certain position. I've been that person to tell organizers, hey, move this thing that's in the way, or please consider moving the caption board. I don't know what it's called, but the screen that has the captions on it. Otherwise, it really depends on the place I'm going in, and it's hard to give advice that is useful because it really depends on the many ways that someone could have set up the environment. But what I will always do slightly before, or even well before, is to make sure that wherever I speak, there are captioners. I refuse to speak somewhere that doesn't have captioners. And if I can, I will also advocate for live ASL translations because those provide such important context to things that we're saying. I saw a deaf person on Twitter whose name I forget, please excuse me, say that if you wanted to try to understand what it might be like to only have captions and not have ASL, try watching a whole film with just captions on and realize that you're missing something important that adds depth and richness. So we should all advocate for ASL wherever we can.
I think that those are really great points. And on the same vein, something I try to be mindful of is in the environment that I'm speaking in, how large is the space? I always make sure that I insist on using a microphone. Something that is a personal pet hate of mine is when someone's like, I'm loud, I don't need a microphone. I'm loud, I need a microphone. Because there's no reason not to, and you are making the assumption that your hearing level, without all the ambient noise, so many other factors. So always advocate for a microphone and speakers. Slide text placement. This is something that Henri, who was on an earlier panel, did a really great session on at the conference that Aisha and I spoke at in Toronto, which is about making sure that you're not including critical information, especially in the bottom. Find out where the captioning is going to happen and adjust your slide design. Sometimes, I've definitely been the person who has some critical information at the bottom of the slide and the captioning text is running over it. That's not great. So trying to keep your slide placement for captioning, but also for context. If you're in a big room that has flat seating, which is common, then people in the back might not be able to see stuff on the bottom. There might be some heads in the way. So try to keep critical text at the top of your slides. Contrast. You are looking at your slides on your monitor in your nice house, office, whatever. You are likely going to be in a room where they're not going to dim the lights. I hate sitting in super lit rooms. I kind of like a little werewolf. I like to sit in the dark. Most conferences are very well lit, which is probably a good thing. So ensure that your contrast will work on a giant projector screen. I always err on just upping the contrast as much as possible. A lot of those screens also don't have great color rendering. So I know that's really hard for designers who want to use subtle color differences. Just err on the side of making it as high contrast as possible. So again, all of this comes to caring for your audience is recognizing the context of the space and of the people.
Right, and I also just want to say that if you realize you're in a large flat space, it might be time to read your slides more than you'd want to read them out loud as a speaker, because you want to make sure that everyone gets the full text of what you want to say, which is again why I try to make sure that I say a lot of the words that I've written, because I don't want to assume anyone can see the text or even the imagery, of course, at all. And it might require explaining things differently or adjusting on the fly, but it really depends on your best judgment and the context in which you're speaking.
Something I always try to do as a speaker, if I'm not doing the opening keynote, is to make sure I attend at least one other talk to see some of the technical context, and almost letting that person's context provide me with ways to make adjustments.
Definitely.
That's a great tip for sure. Getting a chance to see just what you're working with, especially if you don't have the opportunity to do a tech check beforehand.
And
Which note to all organizers, please do tech checks and try to give your speakers time to realize what your system is like before then, because it's a lot of anxiety for us if we have no idea what's going to happen.
Yeah, I would say that along with the tech check, recognizing that we're in a global pandemic and doing a lot more things remotely, recognizing what overlays might be in place and seeing if you can get access to those, because those often cause like so much chaos, and I can only imagine how stressful that can be for neurodivergent folks to like have all these things all over the place. So simplifying your screens to accommodate some of the stream overlays that might be happening, advertising, rolling ticker. You don't want to look like CNN. It's not a good look.
And if you're going to be speaking at one of these events, you can also advocate as a speaker that please don't use overlays that would cause these problems. Not just for my talk, but for everyone who might experience this conference. Don't do animations. Don't do certain things that would be harmful. And if you as a speaker want to save space on your slides, you can even advocate that certain information that would otherwise be easily missed and could be included at the bottom of your slide just gets put in the overlay along with your name and things like that. So in this case, I can see my Twitter handle along with my name, which would be a good thing to put in any virtual conference for someone alongside someone's deck.
And I just want to say, like, explicitly, because I know that explicit detail, not explicit in the adult sense, but explicit detail in the sense of when you're using, I've gotten to the point where I just kind of wish that people would be very, very careful with their GIF use specifically. I know that GIFs are something that we all really love, but in a talk, if you are leaving a GIF up there, which I've definitely done for 2 minutes or a minute as you're talking through something, it can make people very sick. It makes me very sick. I experience a lot of motion sickness. So really question if it needs to be a GIF. Maybe it can just work as a static image. Maybe you don't need the image at all, but just taking a bit more care and recognizing that the GIF usage is a little out of control these days. And it can get very sickening, especially if you're thinking about streaming. GIFs are coming through choppy. If it's on a giant projector, sometimes like it gets really unpleasant. So yeah, just
and if you have
care and think about it.
Sorry, I was going to say, if you have to include a GIF, just say, hey, I'm about to show a GIF for about a few seconds. Then you show it, you describe it, and then you take the GIF away. Because maybe it is really important. I'm not going to say that GIFs are never relevant to an argument or never important. If you're going to talk about animation, you kind of have to talk about GIFs and show GIFs. But you can always box them in a warning to make sure that everyone who needs to look away can look away.
And I believe that most, sorry, Aisha, I believe that most technologies, I know we're getting really granular here, but most technologies have the ability to play the GIF once. They tend to default to looping the GIF. So it is a setting that you have to go and manually adjust, but a well worthwhile one.
You read my mind. Perfect. And that kind of covers my next question, which was, do you have any advice that is specific to online events? But if you do have anything to add, please feel free.
There's so many things that I could say about access, but the biggest one, honestly, is, as with everything, captions, because people are going to be experiencing things, and because they might want the option to be able to enjoy the content however they please. You want to have live captions. You want to, I don't know. I could just rant endlessly and aimlessly about this, just because there's so many things that we could say that are not specific and take up a lot of time. So please, Tatiana.
One prescriptive thing, as someone who is, I recognize the irony here. I don't really love watching videos. There's very few videos I love watching. Same with podcasts. Don't really love listening to podcasts. Love reading. So if a friend sends me a podcast link, I'm to the point where I'm like, is there a transcript? Because I won't listen to it. So something I haven't seen a lot of that I'd love to see with the abundance of online events is transcripts of talks and of panels, because I'm personally much more inclined to read something than I am to have a video. So I think that's another layer of access that I personally haven't seen yet that I would love to see. So yeah, building that into your budget, would be
Yeah.
great.
One other form I've thought of that a friend kind of introduced me to as a concept, which I now enjoy, is the ability to watch talks afterward at your own speed, because maybe you want to be able to digest something that you learned or something that's important, but you don't have time to listen to the whole thing. So it would be helpful, and you'd include more people if you with consent from the speakers, shipped your talks as videos that could be watched at the watcher's own pace, which is whether slower or faster.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think a lot of folks are kind of on board with, okay, we need captions, but not necessarily making it easy to just read the transcript. Even if you have captions that are embedded with the video, you still have to watch the video in order to access that. And
because sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think another layer of video is not just that we, a preference thing. It's an access thing on many axes, like whether or not someone can read, and also the ability to translate it. Also, streaming video is very data heavy, so we're kind of taking a Wi-Fi biased approach when many countries in the world rely on data plans. So it's just, I guess the point I'm trying to make passively that I should make actively is that access has many dimensions that I don't think we always do a great job about talking about in explicit terms. So providing maybe less, because I think conference organizers might be thinking, oh my God, that's so much budget. And I think that looking at that through a budget lens is, well, capitalism, but also maybe that means that you need to lessen the amount of talks that you're doing or the number of conferences you're giving and making them higher quality and higher access.
Mm-hmm. The most central theme to accessibility is giving the user choices or person choices on how they want to experience your content. So on the web, that means making sure that someone can use a keyboard. But if you're in the audience, that means that you have the choice to read the talk or watch the talk at whatever pace you want to watch it at. And so if you're trying to organize around the theme of audience choice, you'll likely be more inclusive than you would be otherwise.
Something that I haven't done a great job at, which I would love to do more, is to convert my talks to long form blog posts. A lot of speakers have started to do that, and I think it's a really lovely way to provide yet another way to access your blog content that can be very editorial and interesting, and it forces you to tell the same story through a different medium, which I always welcome that challenge myself.
And you're likely also to include people who wouldn't otherwise enjoy talks because maybe they don't enjoy being talked at, regardless of how inclusive you are. But someone might enjoy reading your blog post and feeling like they're reading, an important science journal or something like that.
Yeah, and also again, the translation aspect, being able to translate written content much more easily than audio, video content.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we do have a question in the chat. How do we manage the trade-off to speakers between two kinds of advice? Use less text and make slides less busy, which caters to the idea that we lose audience attention by overloading them, or use more text and make slides more accessible, so that catering to the idea that we should do no harm and empower the most vulnerable. So I think that I need to try to be a moderator and not a member of this panel. But please.
I welcome your contributions as a member of the panel, Aisha. But I'd like to start by thanking the asker for this question. This is something I struggle with a lot. And before I answer in a direct way, I'd like to say that we should frame the advice that we get about how to make talks against whether or not we know for sure someone isn't trying to serve certain ableist narratives about who deserves what kind of information. So by saying, don't put text in your talks, no one cares about that, only speak. What you're saying is somebody who needs textual information to understand what you're saying isn't important as an audience member. So we're implicitly excluding people and deciding who's important by giving really authoritative advice on how to make talks. That said, this is a very important question, and the answer is to try and try again and edit yourself, because you'll find in making talks that you maybe haven't included enough basic information that's not imagery, or maybe you've included too little imagery at all. And it really depends on your awareness of the topic that you're speaking of, and your awareness of your audience, and also feedback from friends helps. I could say a lot, but I want to give a chance for Tatiana to chime in.
I think that we, as someone who wrote a talk on our over reliance on binary options, I think it can be both. I think that for me, with the long versus short form, how I might handle that is to say, can I expose speaker notes or long form supplementary copy to the audience? And so if someone wants more context, what I could frame my talk as, the slides I'm doing, I'm keeping very minimal and making sure that I'm making them as accessible as possible. If you prefer to read more context or to have the long form content in front of you, I've included those in the speaker notes, which you can access here. So I think that, like what EJ said earlier, accessibility is providing as many options as possible and recognizing you're probably not going to be perfect at it. I think there's something I want to touch on really quickly is that I think that we almost lead with this idea of trying to be perfect. And as much as we want to lead with our best foot and to be as accessible as possible at all times, I think we always need to leave room for the fact that there are areas that we are not aware of, and we need to be open to adapting to them, because you're not going to make your talk 100% accessible. That's not even a real thing. It's how can you make your talk as accessible to as many people as possible and reduce the harm to as many people as possible. You're always going to cause harm and you're always going to be inaccessible. And that also shouldn't be a sentence that turns you away from trying your hardest.
Mm-hmm. One thing I want to say that applies to accessibility advice in general is if this is about you as a speaker not wanting to include people as much as possible, do the thing you know how to do well and make it accessible in the way that you know how. If you find out that you've left something out, that sucks, but focus on solving the problems you understand and can solve so that you don't shy away from trying at all with paralysis.
Yeah, absolutely. We work with what we got, and then we continue to move forward, which brings me to my final question. How do you respond when you realize that you've made a mistake and potentially harmed someone? What do you do next?
I'll be as brief as possible. I first say thank you to the person who pointed out that I've made a mistake or caused harm, and I try to listen. I say that I will go away and research if they haven't provided me information on what I've done to cause harm. Otherwise, I read what they've said and I try to engage them as meaningfully as I can. And I would like to leave the rest of this floor for Tatiana to speak on.
I think that, yes, apologizing, and I think the best recipe for an apology is to keep it sincere and concise. Don't use qualifiers. I'm sorry if I caused harm. I'm sorry that I caused you harm. I also think that acknowledgement that you will try to do better in the future. You can basically just write out the apology and write all the excuses you need, write it out, and then delete it. Because you know that context, and that context is important for you to acknowledge. Write it down for you, but don't burden the other person with that. Don't burden the person who pointed out to you to make you feel better. That's not their job. That's a huge one.
Absolutely. EJ, did you have something?
No, I was just going to say that the apology is not about you; it's about the person you've harmed, and we have to interface with our desire to make it about us at all times as humans.
And don't expect for them to say it's okay. Like your apology should be given with no expectation of response.
Mm-hmm.
Let alone forgiveness.
No, that's
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both so much. I so appreciate you doing this and sharing your knowledge and your experience. Folks, if folks want to follow you, I'm guessing Twitter, but if there's anything else, please.
That's it. Mainly Twitter, which is on the screen as @CODEABILITY under me. And Tatiana, if you want to give yours.
I was just going to do the exact same thing. That makes me feel good that you did that. My social media handle tends to be @TATIANATMAC, Tatiana T. Mac.
Awesome. I appreciate y'all so much. We are going to take another 10-minute break for our captioner Tess. And thank you so much again to Tess. And then we will be back with how to prepare with Ben Hong.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Aisha. Happy birthday.